The year is 1914. Europe is a powder keg, its monarchs and generals bound together in a web of alliances, ambitions, and rivalries that stretch from the North Sea to the Balkans. At the very heart of this tension lies the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a vast, fragile patchwork of peoples, languages, and cultures. Among them, on the empire's southern frontier, lies Croatia. To outsiders, Croatia is merely a province, a cog in the imperial machine. But to those who lived there, it was something else. A land of proud traditions, a kingdom with its own history, its own aspirations, and its own unresolved question of identity. And in the summer of 1914, that question was about to collide head-on with the outbreak of the First World War. Croatia in the early 20th century was part of the Habsburg monarchy, formally tied to Hungary through the Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867. Officially, it was the Kingdom of Croatia and Slavonia, a crown land that answered to Budapest. In practice, this meant that while Croatia had its own Sabor parliament and a degree of local autonomy, the real power lay elsewhere, in Vienna and, increasingly, in Budapest. For many Croats, this arrangement was suffocating. Nationalist movements were stirring, inspired by the romantic wave of the 19th century that had swept through Europe. Croats wanted recognition not as a province but as a nation, equal among others. Yet they found themselves overshadowed by Hungarian dominance and trapped within the bureaucracy of a multi-ethnic empire that seemed incapable of reform. This tension gave rise to competing visions of the future. Some believed in greater autonomy within the empire, dreaming of a trialist system: Austria, Hungary, and Croatia. Others looked beyond the empire entirely, toward unity with other South Slavs, Serbs, Slovenes, Bosnians, in a pan-Slavic vision of independence. But before these debates could be resolved, history intervened. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, traveled to Sarajevo in neighboring Bosnia. His assassination by a Serbian nationalist lit the fuse of what would become the Great War. For the empire, Sarajevo was the breaking point. For Croatia, it was a thunderclap. Suddenly, the abstract debates of nationalism and empire became brutally real. The Habsburg monarchy declared war on Serbia, and Croatia, bound within that monarchy, would be thrust into a conflict that was not of its choosing but would define its future. In the summer of 1914, the call went out. Mobilization swept across the empire. In villages and towns across Croatia, young men received orders to report for service. Some were farmers pulled from their fields. Others were students pulled from their classrooms. Many had never left their villages before. Now they would be sent to fight in Galicia against the Russians, or on the Isonzo front against the Italians, or even against the Serbs, people with whom they shared language and culture. The irony was bitter. Croats, who dreamed of greater autonomy or unity with fellow South Slavs, were now asked to fight to preserve the very empire that denied them those dreams. Some answered the call dutifully, bound by loyalty, tradition, or sheer necessity. Others did so reluctantly, their hearts heavy with doubt. Still, the machinery of empire was relentless. By the end of 1914, tens of thousands of Croats were in uniform, their fates tied to a war whose causes and consequences were far beyond their control. The Austro-Hungarian army was a reflection of the empire itself. Diverse, multilingual, and often chaotic. Soldiers from Croatia found themselves in regiments alongside Hungarians, Germans, Czechs, Poles, and Slovaks. Orders were given in German or Hungarian, languages many Croats did not fully understand. This linguistic chaos was more than just an inconvenience. On the battlefield, it was deadly. Confusion in communication often led to mistakes, misunderstandings, and unnecessary casualties. Yet, despite these challenges, Croatian soldiers quickly earned a reputation for toughness and resilience. Their units fought with determination on multiple fronts, from the frozen trenches of Galicia to the rugged mountains along the Italian border. Back home, families struggled. The war effort drained resources, and shortages soon became a daily reality. Croatian peasants bore the brunt of food requisitions, while cities like Zagreb were filled with both patriotic rallies and quiet grumbling. The empire's propaganda machine tried to keep morale high, But beneath the surface, discontent simmered. For Croatian leaders, the war posed a profound dilemma. Officially, they were expected to support the empire's cause. Many did so, hoping that loyalty would be rewarded with greater autonomy after victory. Others, however, saw the war as an opportunity. If the Austro-Hungarian Empire was weakened or even destroyed, perhaps Croatia could finally achieve independence, or at least join with other South Slavs in a new state. The assassination in Sarajevo had already sharpened tensions between Croats and Serbs within the empire. Some Croats viewed Serbia with suspicion, seeing it as both a rival and a potential liberator. Others felt a deep kinship, tied by language and culture, and hoped for unity once the war was over. Thus, Croatia entered the Great War divided not just between empire and nation but within itself. The irony of history weighed heavily on Croatia in 1914. A millennium earlier, in the 10th century, it had been an independent kingdom under Tomislav. Now, in the 20th century, it was once again caught between greater powers, Austria, Hungary, Serbia, and the rising forces of nationalism that threatened to redraw the map of Europe. In some ways, the war was a continuation of an old story. Croatia as a frontier, a land in between, where empires clashed and nations dreamed. And as the first shots of the Great War echoed across Europe, Croats braced themselves for a storm that would reshape not only their lives but the destiny of their nation. The First World War is often remembered as a conflict of trenches in France, of artillery barrages and poison gas on the Western Front. But for Croatia, the war would be fought elsewhere, on the empire's eastern and southern borders, in mountains and rivers, in villages and farmlands. It would be a war of contradictions. Croats fighting bravely for an empire many resented. Families praying for sons who fought against neighbors they could easily have called brothers. Leaders torn between loyalty to Vienna and dreams of independence. The stage was set. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, that fragile mosaic of nations, was marching into the fire. And Croatia, bound to its fate, marched with it. The war to end all wars had begun. The train whistles echoed across the stations of Zagreb, Split, Osijek, and countless small towns scattered across Croatia. It was late summer 1914, and the mobilization orders had transformed villages into scenes of sorrow and duty. Families gathered by the tracks, waving handkerchiefs and clutching rosaries, as young men boarded trains destined for the unknown. Mothers whispered prayers, wives fought back tears, and children clung to fathers who promised they would return. But many never would. For the Croats, the war did not come with choice, it came with command. The Austro-Hungarian Empire demanded soldiers, and Croatia answered, whether with loyalty, resignation, or quiet resistance. The front lines stretched in every direction, and Croats, like so many of the empire's subjects, were scattered across them all. The first destination for many Croats was the bleak expanse of Galicia, in modern-day Ukraine and Poland. Here, the Austro-Hungarian army faced the Russian Empire in battles that were as brutal as they were chaotic. The Croats, used to Mediterranean sun and Balkan hills, suddenly found themselves in muddy trenches under icy winds. The winters of Galicia were merciless. Soldiers wrapped rags around their feet to fend off frostbite. Supplies often failed to arrive, and hunger gnawed at their strength. Yet they dug trenches, mounted defenses, and endured bombardments that seemed endless. In late 1914, at battles like Lemberg and Przemysl, Croatian regiments were thrown into the thick of the fighting. Artillery shells rained down with a fury that shook the earth itself. Whole companies were annihilated in minutes. Survivors huddled together, eyes hollow, their uniforms stiff with mud and blood. Letters home, when they reached their families, spoke of despair, of comrades buried where they fell, of nights haunted by the screams of the wounded. For the empire, Galicia was a nightmare. For the Croats, it was a distant land of suffering, where loyalty to the Habsburg crown came at a terrible price. Perhaps the cruelest irony was that many Croats were sent to fight against Serbia, a nation that shared their language, culture, and even blood ties. The campaigns against Serbia in 1914 and 1915 were marked by ferocious battles along rivers and mountains. Croatian soldiers, marching under the Austro-Hungarian flag, found themselves ordered to cross into Serbia and engage an enemy who, in another reality, might have been an ally. The fighting was savage. At the Battle of Ser in August 1914, Austro-Hungarian forces, including Croat regiments, suffered a humiliating defeat. Serbian fighters, hardened and motivated by defense of their homeland, repelled the invaders with shocking effectiveness. For the Croats, the loss cut deeper. They were not only defeated but defeated by people with whom they felt an undeniable kinship. Whispers spread through the ranks. Soldiers quietly asked why they were fighting, why they were spilling blood for Vienna and Budapest against men who could just as easily have stood beside them in a different cause. Some Croats deserted, slipping away in the chaos of retreat. Others, captured by Serbs, were treated not as foreign invaders but as misguided brothers. This strange war within a war deepened Croatia's internal divide. Were they bound to empire, or were they meant to join with other South Slavs in a shared destiny? The question lingered like smoke over the battlefields. By 1915, Italy had entered the war against Austria-Hungary, and a new front opened along the Isonzo River in what is today Slovenia. Here, Croats once again found themselves in the thick of battle, this time against Italian forces. The Isonzo front was unlike any other. The battlefield stretched across jagged mountains, steep cliffs, and icy rivers. Soldiers carried not just rifles but also ropes, picks, and shovels, as warfare in the Alps demanded mountaineering as much as marksmanship. Croats, accustomed to the rugged terrain of the Dinaric Alps, adapted quickly. They became known for their toughness in the mountains, scaling cliffs under fire and holding positions where others might falter. But the cost was horrific. The 12 battles of the Isonzo, fought between 1915 and 1917, consumed lives with merciless regularity. Men froze in the snow, starved in supply shortages, and were buried by avalanches triggered by artillery fire. One Croat soldier wrote in his diary, "The mountain is our enemy as much as the Italians. At night, the wind howls like a ghost. In the morning, we bury our friends under the rocks. And still, the order comes, attack." For years, the Isonzo front devoured Croatian regiments, leaving behind shattered survivors who carried scars both visible and invisible. Not all Croats fought to the end. Many were captured and taken prisoner, shipped off to camps deep within Russia or Italy. For these men, the war became a slow struggle of hunger, disease, and despair. Letters from home were rare. Some prisoners never returned, lost to epidemics that swept through the camps. And yet, even in captivity, the politics of identity did not disappear. Among South Slavic prisoners, Croats, Serbs, Slovenes, ideas began to circulate. Pan-Slavic activists whispered of a future beyond Austria-Hungary, a state where all South Slavs would unite. These camps, miserable though they were, became incubators of a dream that would later shape the post-war order. While men fought and died across Europe, the women, children, and elderly of Croatia bore the weight of survival at home. The war drained the countryside of labor, leaving fields untended and harvests poor. Food shortages grew dire, and inflation gnawed at families who could barely afford bread. The Sabor, Croatia's parliament, debated war measures but had little real power. The empire's demands always came first: more grain, more taxes, more men for the front. Resentment grew, not only against Vienna and Budapest but also against local elites seen as complicit in the exploitation. Yet amid the hardship, there was resilience. Communities came together, sharing what little they had. In Zagreb, cultural life continued, with theaters and newspapers keeping spirits alive. But behind the facade, the war was leaving deep scars, economic, social, and psychological, that would not heal quickly. By 1916, the toll was undeniable. Croatia had sent hundreds of thousands of men into the war. Tens of thousands had already been killed, and many more wounded or missing. Every village had its stories of sons who never returned, of fathers lost, of families shattered. The funerals, when bodies were returned, were both personal tragedies and collective events. Church bells tolled endlessly, and the cemeteries filled. A generation of young Croats was being consumed, sacrificed on the altar of an empire's survival. And yet, even as the losses mounted, the empire demanded more. The war dragged on, and with it, the suffering. Amid the despair, whispers of change began to grow louder. News from abroad filtered into Croatia, of revolutions, of changing tides in the war, of cracks appearing in the great empires of Europe. The Russian Revolution of 1917 inspired some, frightening others. If the mighty Romanovs could fall, could the Habsburgs be next? Among Croatian soldiers at the front and intellectuals at home, the idea of independence, or at least unification with other South Slavs, gained momentum. They began to imagine what life might look like after the war. Would Croatia remain shackled to Vienna and Budapest? Or would the blood spilled in Galicia, Serbia, and the Isonzo be the catalyst for a new beginning? By the middle years of the war, Croatia stood at a crossroads. Its people had fought with courage and endured unimaginable hardship. But their loyalty to the empire was cracking under the weight of loss and disillusionment. The Great War was not only testing armies, it was testing nations. For Croatia, the test was existential. Could it endure as a loyal part of a collapsing empire? Or would the sacrifice of its sons push it toward a different destiny? The answer was not yet clear, but as the war ground on, and as Europe inched closer to collapse, Croatia's fate would soon be decided not only by the battles it fought, but by the dreams it dared to imagine. The year was 1917, and Europe was exhausted. What had begun as a war of glory, quick marches, and patriotic fervor was now nothing more than a grinding machine that devoured men, nations, and empires alike. For the Croats within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the dream of loyalty to the Habsburg crown was fading rapidly. The empire itself was unraveling before their very eyes. The Russian Revolution in February 1917 sent shockwaves across Europe. When news reached the trenches and villages of Croatia, it spread like wildfire. Soldiers whispered that if the Russian Tsar could be overthrown, perhaps Vienna and Budapest were not invincible after all. Croatian regiments stationed on the Eastern Front saw firsthand the chaos as Russian soldiers deserted en masse after the Bolsheviks seized power in October. Entire Russian divisions simply melted away, leaving behind empty trenches and discarded rifles. For Croats who had endured 3 long years of mud, blood, and death, the sight was both astonishing and intoxicating. Letters from soldiers described it bluntly. If they can walk away, why can't we? The revolution was more than a distant political event. It was an idea, a spark in the darkness of despair. The Austro-Hungarian authorities recognized the danger. They tightened surveillance, censored newspapers, and punished soldiers suspected of disloyalty. But the cracks in the empire were too deep to conceal. In November 1916, Emperor Franz Joseph, who had ruled Austria-Hungary for nearly 7 decades, died. His successor, Emperor Karl I, inherited not only the throne but also an empire in collapse. Karl was young, energetic, and, unlike his predecessor, desperate to find peace. He made secret attempts to negotiate an end to the war, reaching out through family ties in European courts. But his efforts came too late. The Allies distrusted him, and Germany held too much influence over the empire's decisions. In Croatia, Karl's ascension brought little change. Soldiers still bled on foreign soil, and families still starved at home. His promises of reform rang hollow in the face of continued suffering. If anything, his desperation only underscored the empire's weakness. By 1917, the home front in Croatia was in crisis. Bread lines stretched through city streets, and prices soared beyond what ordinary families could afford. Malnutrition spread, and children grew frail as food became scarcer. In rural areas, farmers resented having their grain requisitioned for the war effort. Riots and protests erupted sporadically, often led by women demanding bread for their families. The Croatian Sabor had little power to stop the exploitation, as decisions were dictated from Vienna and Budapest. The war was no longer just a distant tragedy on the front lines. It was in every Croatian household. Hunger and grief became the language of daily life. Amid this suffering, the dream of a different future began to crystallize. For years, intellectuals and political leaders had debated the South Slavic idea, the belief that Croats, Serbs, and Slovenes belonged together in a single state. In 1917, this vision took a major step forward with the Corfu Declaration, signed by Serbian leaders and representatives of the Yugoslav Committee, a group of South Slavic exiles. The declaration envisioned the creation of a unified state of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes once the war ended. For many Croats, the declaration was a beacon of hope. No longer would they be pawns of Vienna or Budapest. They could be part of something new, something built on shared language, culture, and destiny. But not everyone agreed. Some feared domination by Serbia in such a union, while others remained loyal to the Habsburg crown. The debates were fierce, but the idea had taken root, and it would not easily be extinguished. The longer the war dragged on, the harder it became for the Austro-Hungarian army to maintain discipline. Mutinies broke out across the empire's forces, and Croats were no exception. One of the most significant uprisings occurred in February 1918 at the Kotar Bay naval base in present-day Montenegro. Sailors, many of them Croats, raised red flags and demanded peace, inspired by the Russian Revolution. They refused to obey orders and attempted to seize control of ships. Although the mutiny was eventually suppressed with brutal reprisals, it revealed the growing disillusionment within the empire's armed forces. Loyalty was crumbling, and discipline could no longer be taken for granted. At the same time, desertions increased. Soldiers slipped away from the front lines, hiding in forests or attempting to return to their villages. Others allowed themselves to be captured by the enemy, preferring the uncertain fate of a prisoner of war to the certainty of death in the trenches. By 1918, the Central Powers were faltering. The United States had entered the war on the side of the Allies, bringing fresh troops and resources. Germany, though still formidable, was stretched thin. For Austria-Hungary, the situation was desperate. On the Italian front, where many Croats were stationed, the empire launched its last major offensive at the Battle of Piave in June 1918. Hopes were high that a decisive victory might turn the tide. But the offensive ended in disaster. The Austro-Hungarian army, weakened by years of exhaustion and lacking supplies, could not break through. Morale collapsed. Soldiers, including Croatian regiments, abandoned their positions in droves. The failure at Piave marked the beginning of the end. The empire was no longer capable of fighting effectively. By autumn 1918, the Austro-Hungarian army was disintegrating. Units refused orders, officers deserted alongside their men, and entire divisions surrendered without firing a shot. On the Isonzo front, where Croats had fought for years, the final Italian offensive at Vittorio Veneto in late October smashed what remained of the empire's resistance. The army dissolved into chaos, with soldiers streaming back toward their homelands. For Croats, it was both an ending and a beginning. The war that had consumed them for 4 long years was finally collapsing. But what would replace it remained uncertain. As soldiers returned to Croatia, they found a homeland both relieved and devastated. Villages welcomed back their sons, but the joy was tempered by the empty spaces left by those who had not returned. The returning soldiers were gaunt, weary, and haunted. They carried with them stories of mud-choked trenches, mountain battles, and comrades buried in foreign soil. Their presence was a reminder of the empire's failure and of the immense price Croatia had paid. Families embraced their loved ones, but even in reunion, questions lingered. What had it all been for? Whose war had they fought? And what would become of Croatia now that the empire was gone? In October 1918, as the Austro-Hungarian Empire crumbled, Croatian leaders took decisive action. They established the National Council of Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs, based in Zagreb. This council declared itself the representative body of South Slavic peoples within the empire and sought to negotiate their future. The council faced a critical choice. Should Croatia remain tied to Austria-Hungary in some reformed federation, or should it seek unification with Serbia and Slovenia? The decision would shape the destiny of the nation. Amid the uncertainty, one thing was clear. The empire that had ruled Croatia for centuries was dead. A new era was dawning, though its shape was still uncertain. By early November 1918, Austria-Hungary had effectively ceased to exist. Emperor Karl renounced participation in state affairs. though he never formally abdicated. The once mighty empire fractured into pieces. Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and more. In Croatia, the National Council declared independence from the empire. Crowds filled the streets of Zagreb, waving flags and cheering, though their joy was tempered by hunger and grief. The war was over, but the wounds it had left were deep. On November 11, 1918, the guns of Europe finally fell silent. The armistice had been signed. For Croatia, as for much of the world, relief mixed with uncertainty. Tens of thousands of Croats had died in the service of an empire that no longer existed. Countless others returned maimed, scarred, or broken. The war had tested Croatia's endurance and reshaped its destiny. And now, at the end of it all, the nation stood on the threshold of a new beginning. One that would soon lead to the creation of a new state, the kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. But the transition would not be simple, nor would it be without conflict. The war was over, but the struggle for Croatia's future had only just begun. The guns had fallen silent in November 1918, but peace was far from secure. For Croatia, the end of the Great War was not an ending at all. It was the beginning of a new and uncertain chapter. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had collapsed, but what would rise from its ruins was still up for debate. The Croats, battered by 4 years of sacrifice, found themselves facing a profound question. Were they to reclaim their independence, ally themselves with fellow South Slavs, or remain vulnerable to the ambitions of larger powers? The answer, forged in the chaos of the post-war years, would reshape the destiny of the Balkans. In October 1918, as the empire disintegrated, Croatian leaders formed the National Council of Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs in Zagreb. It was a bold step, an assertion that they, not Vienna or Budapest, would now decide the future. The council declared independence from Austria-Hungary and assumed authority over Croatian lands. Across towns and villages, imperial officials packed their belongings, while Croatian banners were raised over government buildings. Crowds gathered in squares, cheering as symbols of Habsburg rule were torn down. But the National Council faced immediate challenges. The war had left the country devastated. Food shortages persisted, returning soldiers demanded recognition, and rival factions jostled for power. Worse, Croatia stood exposed to the ambitions of neighbors who saw an opportunity to expand their borders. One of the greatest threats came from the West. Italy, though an ally of the Entente, had entered the war in 1915 with promises of territorial rewards under the Treaty of London. Among those promised lands were parts of the Dalmatian coast, which had long been contested between Italians and Croats. As the empire crumbled, Italian troops advanced into Dalmatia and Istria, occupying towns and ports. To many Croats, this felt like an invasion. Rumors spread of Italian annexation, and anger boiled over in protests. The National Council protested diplomatically but had little power to stop the Italians. Their presence underscored a harsh reality. Croatia, on its own, was vulnerable. Without allies, it risked being carved apart by stronger neighbors. It was against this backdrop that the National Council faced its fateful decision: whether to declare full independence or to seek union with other South Slavs. On December 1, 1918, after hurried negotiations, the Council proclaimed unification with the Kingdom of Serbia and the newly liberated territories of Slovenia. Together, they formed the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, a state that would later be known as Yugoslavia. In Zagreb, bells rang and crowds celebrated. For many, it felt like the fulfillment of the South Slavic idea, a nation where Croats, Serbs, and Slovenes would stand together as equals, free from foreign empires. But beneath the celebration lay unease. Some Croats worried that in joining with Serbia, they were trading one master for another. Serbia, victorious and backed by the Allies, entered the Union from a position of strength. Croatian leaders, exhausted and pressed by the threat of Italian expansion, had little leverage. It soon became clear that the Union was not what many Croats had envisioned. The new kingdom was officially a constitutional monarchy under the Serbian Karađorđević dynasty. Its capital was not Zagreb or Ljubljana but Belgrade. Croats quickly realized that power was concentrated in Serbian hands. The The central government dominated the political system, leaving little room for Croatian autonomy. The dream of equality among South Slavs began to wither almost as soon as it was proclaimed. Disillusionment spread. Croats who had hoped for a federation, where each nation could govern itself within a larger union, felt betrayed. Instead, they found themselves under a centralized state that often ignored or suppressed their aspirations. The social wounds of the Great War compounded these political frustrations. Croatia had lost tens of thousands of men on the battlefields of Galicia, the Isonzo, and Serbia. Families grieved for sons, fathers, and brothers who would never return. The returning veterans, many of them disabled or traumatized, found little support from the new government. Jobs were scarce, pensions inadequate, and recognition absent. Their sacrifices, made in the service of an empire that no longer existed, seemed to have been in vain. This discontent simmered in the streets of Zagreb and Split. Veterans' organizations formed, demanding justice and respect, while peasants, still facing food shortages and poverty, grew restless. The post-war years were not marked by triumph but by hardship and resentment. The Catholic Church, a powerful force in Croatian society, played a complex role in this transition. On one hand, it supported the idea of South Slavic unity, seeing it as a bulwark against foreign domination. On the other, it feared the dominance of Orthodox Serbia within the new kingdom. This tension reflected the broader identity crisis facing Croatia. Were Croats primarily Catholics tied to Western Europe, or South Slavs united with their Orthodox and Muslim neighbors? The question was not merely cultural but political, influencing loyalties and shaping debates in the fledgling state. The years immediately following unification were turbulent. Croatian politicians struggled to assert their voice within the new kingdom. The Croatian Peasant Party, led by Stjepan Radic, emerged as a powerful force, representing the frustrations of peasants and demanding greater autonomy for Croatia. Radic was outspoken in his criticism of Belgrade's centralism. He warned that the Croats had fallen from one slavery into another. His words resonated with many who felt that the union had been a rushed, unequal bargain made under duress. The government in Belgrade responded with repression. Dissidents were monitored, protests suppressed, and the dream of a truly equal South Slavic state seemed ever more distant. Strangely, as the disappointments of the new kingdom grew, some Croats began to look back on the Habsburg years with a sense of nostalgia. Though the empire had been flawed, it had at least recognized Croatia as a kingdom within its structure, however limited that autonomy was. Now, in the centralized Yugoslav kingdom, even that recognition seemed to vanish. Croatia was just another region, its institutions subordinated to Belgrade. For a people who had sacrificed so much in the Great War, this felt like a bitter betrayal. The unification of South Slavs had been hailed as a triumph, but for many Croats, it quickly revealed itself as a compromise made under pressure. They had avoided Italian annexation and escaped the collapse of empire, but the cost was steep: a loss of autonomy, growing resentment, and political instability. The dream of equality had given way to a reality of imbalance. The seeds of future conflict were already sown in these early years, as Croats questioned whether the sacrifices of the Great War had brought them freedom, or merely exchanged one master for another. By the early 1920s, Croatia was a nation at a crossroads. It had survived the collapse of Austria-Hungary, endured the horrors of the Great War, and entered into a new South Slavic kingdom. But its people were weary, its politics unstable, and its identity unresolved. The promises of peace and prosperity after the war remained elusive. Instead, Croats faced poverty, disillusionment, and political subordination. The memory of independence, distant though it was, lingered like a ghost. The Great War had ended, but for Croatia, the struggle for self-determination was only beginning. The year was 1918, and the world was standing on the edge of profound transformation. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, once a giant that had encompassed dozens of nationalities, was collapsing like a building whose foundations had been eaten away by time and war. For Croatia, a land whose sons had fought and bled on nearly every front of the Great War, this collapse meant both uncertainty and opportunity. It was a moment of decision, one that would forever change the trajectory of its people. As the Central Powers faltered and defeat became inevitable, revolutionary movements surged across Europe. Soldiers were deserting en masse, officers were resigning, and the once proud military machine of Austria-Hungary was fragmenting into pieces of disorganized battalions and half-starved units. In Zagreb, Split, and Dubrovnik, Croatians looked on with a mixture of dread and hope. Would they finally seize their independence, or would they simply fall under yet another master? The death knell of Austria-Hungary rang loudly in October 1918, when national councils began declaring sovereignty from Vienna. In Croatia, the National Council of Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs was formed, with its seat in Zagreb. The council declared that Croats would no longer submit to orders from the imperial capital. For centuries, Croatians had been sandwiched between empires, fighting first against the Ottomans, then under Habsburg rule, and later absorbed into the complicated machinery of Austria-Hungary. Now, for the first time in centuries, the possibility of self-determination was at their doorstep. But freedom, as history has so often shown, is never simple. In the chaos of the empire's collapse, different factions within Croatia argued about the path forward. Some wanted a truly independent Croatian state, standing apart from all others. Others argued that Croatia could not survive alone, squeezed between larger and more powerful neighbors. The memory of centuries of Ottoman pressure, Hungarian dominance, and Austrian rule weighed heavily on their decision. The safest path, they argued, was unity, but unity with whom? The answer came quickly. On December 1, 1918, Croatia formally joined the newly created Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, which would later become known as Yugoslavia. This union was heralded by some as a victory, the realization of a long-dreamed South Slavic identity. For the first time, Croats were not merely subjects of an empire, but partners in a new kingdom of Slavs. But not everyone celebrated. In the streets of Zagreb, debates raged. Some saw this union as a betrayal, a hasty surrender of sovereignty at the very moment when Croatia might have stood on its own. Many worried that in this new state, dominated by Belgrade, Croatians would simply exchange one master for another. The political battles that followed would haunt the country for decades to come. Meanwhile, the scars of the war remained raw. Croats returning from the front lines carried stories of unimaginable suffering. Some had fought in the bloody quagmire of the Italian front, battling across the icy heights of the Isonzo River. Others had been sent to Galicia to fight against the Russians, enduring winters so cold that rifles froze in their hands. Still others had been shipped to the Balkans, where guerrilla warfare and disease killed as many as the bullets and shells. For many, the war had stolen their youth, leaving behind broken bodies and haunted minds. And yet, even amidst the sorrow, a new identity was forming. The war had taught Croatians hard lessons. The fragility of empires, the futility of endless sacrifice for foreign rulers, and the necessity of shaping their own destiny. The Great War had not simply ended Austria-Hungary. It had awakened a spirit of self-awareness in the Croatian people. In the years that followed, this spirit would clash repeatedly with the political realities of the new kingdom. Croatian leaders demanded greater autonomy, arguing that their nation had its own history, its own culture, and deserved more than to be treated as a province under Serbian dominance. Tensions simmered, sometimes exploding into open conflict. But all of these struggles had their roots in 1918, in that moment when the empire collapsed and Croatians were forced to decide their future. But here's the question that lingers like an echo. Was the decision to join Yugoslavia the right one? Or was it a tragic mistake that set Croatia on a path of decades of turmoil and eventual bloodshed? To answer this, we must look at the alternatives. If Croatia had declared full independence in 1918, it would have faced immense challenges. The country was exhausted, its economy devastated by war, its army scattered and demoralized. Neighboring Italy was eyeing the Adriatic coast hungrily, eager to expand its territory. Hungary, though defeated, remained a threat, and without allies, Croatia might have been swallowed whole by one of its larger neighbors. Unity with other South Slavs may have been the only option for survival at that moment. But survival came at a cost. a cost that Croats would debate for the rest of the century. As the 1920s dawned, Croatia found itself in a strange position. The old world of empires was gone. The new world of nation-states was taking shape. Yet Croatia's identity was caught between the two. It was not an empire's subject anymore, but neither was it a fully independent nation. It was something in between, a partner in a kingdom where true equality remained elusive. And in this fragile balance, the memory of World War I lived on. The war was not just a military catastrophe. It was the end of an era. The Croats who marched to the front in 1914 had done so as subjects of the Habsburg crown. Those who returned in 1918 found themselves citizens of a kingdom that had not even existed when they left. In just 4 years, their world had been transformed beyond recognition. So, what is the legacy of World War I for Croatia? It is a story of sacrifice, of young men who fought in battles far from home, often for a cause that was not their own. It is a story of disillusionment, of a people who discovered that victory and defeat could mean the same thing when your fate was decided in foreign capitals. But it is also a story of awakening, of a nation realizing that its destiny could not forever be entrusted to others. The Great War ended with treaties and new borders. But for Croatia, it ended with questions. Questions that would shape the century to come. Would they find true equality in the kingdom they had joined? Would their culture, their language, their traditions survive the pull of centralization from Belgrade? Would they ever achieve the full independence that had slipped from their grasp in 1918? These were not questions for the diplomats of Versailles to answer. They were questions for the Croats themselves. Questions that would echo through history, through the Second World War, through the bloody wars of the 1990s, and into the modern day. Perhaps the greatest tragedy of World War I for Croatia was that even in victory, even in survival, they remained unfulfilled. They had escaped one empire, but had yet to build a truly sovereign state of their own. And so, the war ended not with closure, but with the beginning of a new struggle. And that is the paradox of history. Sometimes the end of one war is only the prologue to another. So, when we look back at 1918, we see more than the fall of Austria-Hungary. We see the birth of a new identity, fragile and uncertain, yet undeniably real. We see a people who had endured centuries of domination, now standing on the threshold of something new. And we see the cost of choices made in moments of desperation, choices whose consequences would reverberate across generations. The First World War may have ended on November 11, 1918, but for Croatia, its shadow stretched long into the future. And so, we are left with one haunting question, one that lingers like the echo of a distant gunshot across the battlefields of history. Did Croatia's journey toward true independence begin in 1918, or was it postponed, delayed by the compromises of a desperate time, waiting for another century to finally come to fruition? The answer, perhaps, lies not in the past, but in the legacy of a people who never stopped striving for freedom, no matter how many empires tried to claim them.